Welcome to Quilting's first reality show, live and unscripted with Susan Smith.
So fun. And thanks for that little excerpt to our son, Will, who does those little quotes for me, those little welcomes. So credits to him. And also credit is due here at the beginning, too, to our friend Dan, who allows us to use his guitar music sprinkled throughout these episodes, and my husband, Dave, who's behind the scenes. That said, I am Susan Smith. You are in my studio, Stitched by Susan, for a morning for me, but an hour or two of live and unscripted freehand quilting. Why live and unscripted? Because I feel like it can be really helpful, especially to newer or novice quilters, to see things in real time as they happen, to see some of the oopses, some of the thread breaks or needle breaks or tension issues as they're happening and how we deal with them. And then also just to see the process of quilting, like how do you pull up the thread, or do you not bury your threads, or how are some of these things done. So these live and unscripted episodes are aired the first and third Friday of each month, just to give you a chance to kind of watch over my shoulder as I'm working on a quilt. And me being me and loving to explain things, I tend to chat while I'm working, so you get a lot of information, maybe more than you wanted, about what I'm doing and the choices and the decisions and all those things. So that's what live and unscripted is all about. Today we are working on a freehand edge-to-edge project. So I'll be doing the whole quilt, right from loading through the quilting all the way to the finish. So we'll talk about basting, squaring it up, thread choices, those sorts of things as we go along. Also, if you are enjoying this show, I encourage you to take a moment to share it with a friend, or especially to like and to subscribe. Someone mentioned earlier notifications. If you do subscribe, you can actually click on the little bell and YouTube will send you notifications when I'm going live. So these shows, they do stay public for anyone's use. We usually have a kind of casual introduction to the live show, and I welcome you by name and chat with the people who are here early in the live show. That does not remain on air, but the whole quilting process does. Let's see what else. If you're interested in supporting the show, we've been having technical trouble today, so if you're interested in helping us look at upgrading some of our equipment, you can do that pretty easily by going to buymeacoffee.com/Stitched by Susan. There you're able to make a one-time contribution of as little as $5, or if you wish, you can sign up for a monthly one as well. So all the funds that come in that way, and many of you have been so generous over the months, all of those funds go into upgrading our equipment, our wires, Dave's table, the hubs, all those things that we need to keep producing these shows. So we keep trying to do better and better shows. And in fact, if you look back a year ago, they're pretty much cringeworthy, to me anyways. So I'm happy to say that we are improving over time. We are learning. Also, I have a podcast if you're interested in some easy listening while you're working in your sewing room or around your house. It's called Measure Twice, Cut Once. And you can find that easily by going to podcast.stitchedbysusan.com. And I gave the credits already, so I'm just checking in with Mr. Okay. One more thing I will tell you all about, which is on the horizon. I've been thinking for many months about introducing a membership where people like you that love seeing my quilting and love my style of teaching can have a little more interaction, can maybe see more behind the scenes, or get a first-hand look at more of my projects. So I'm in the process of launching this membership. It has already gone out to those who have been my students in my freehand quilting masterclass, and they're kind of test driving it for all of you. But in the next couple of days, it is going to become available to all my newsletter subscribers. So as we're recording, it's the 7th of October. So in the next 3 or 4 days, there will be some emails going out about that. So if you're interested in getting in on the ground level, and there is a kind of promotional offer that's going with that, then sign up for my newsletter. So you can either go to my website and an opt-in form will pop up, or if you're in Facebook or Instagram, you can message me, and don't just comment on a post, but actually send me a message with the word news, and you'll get a little link to sign up for the newsletter. So that's an easy way to do it if you want to be in on the ground level and get that introductory offer for the membership. So that's all I'll say about that. Let's get quilting. I'm going to take one more sip of the magic elixir that is coffee and get to quilting. So here's our backing for today. It's this golden yellow. Isn't that pretty? Wanted you to be able to see it before I start loading because it's going to play into the thread choice for today's quilt. I did hold it up, hon. There it is. So my loading on the long arm is done with the red snapper system, which I absolutely love because it's a time saver. But this same method can be used if you're pinning as well, if you don't have the red snappers. And I'll talk about that just a little bit as I'm doing it. So the red snapper system, right here in my leader, there's a little plastic rod that's stiff that's in this hem, and then the plastic one that I'm holding snaps right over the top of it. But if you didn't have this red snapper, you could also pin in the same way. The time savings here is that I do not need to measure the center of my quilt or the center of my leaders. I just need one straight edge for this front. And in this example, today's quilt, I actually have a selvage. So I know that it's straight. So whether you're red snapping or whether you're pinning, it doesn't really matter, and you don't have to worry about centering it. Just get that straight edge fastened. And I used to pin too. I did hundreds of quilts pinning before I had this system, and it works as well. I just started pinning at one side and pinned all the way to the other side. That done, take the rest of the backing and toss it over the long arm rail. And then I will walk around to the other side, and you'll probably see the back of my head while I do the other half. Depending on which camera Mr. Producer turns on. And what I'm doing here, because remember my fabric is not centered, I'm making sure that it is pulled smoothly over this rail and that the whole fall of fabric is smooth down onto the floor too. So this is the important bit. Notice if it's pulled a little to one side, even a ½ inch, watch what happens. You start getting these pulls that have an angle to them. When you see anything angled like that, you know it's not quite straight. Make adjustments until it lays nice and smooth. And then, somewhere here I have a little squirt bottle. This is another magic trick. I don't iron my backings either, but you can see there's some creases going on. They're not very severe, but in order to get rid of those, all I do is gently spritz some water on the backing. And even when they are more severe, for example, when you've got the fold line from a piece of fabric, like as it came from the store with a fold line, I don't iron that out either. Just this gentle spritz of water is enough to relax those creases. I keep having to walk around and around the long arm. You're probably getting dizzy just watching. And once that fabric is all smooth, then the next step is just to roll it on. And now what's happening is just the tension of pulling this fabric over that leader. There's a little bit of resistance there. And that works in my favor to help the fabric just feed smoothly and with a straight of grain, pretty straight of grain, onto my leaders. And when I do see some creases going on, I can just come over and smooth them out. Some fabrics do that more than others. Some roll smoothly the first time. And I'm just watching now so that I stop my rolling when the end of my fabric is coming into view against my other leader. If you're interested in these red snappers, by the way, I do have a link in the show notes for, actually a whole bunch of links, for some of my favorite pieces of equipment, and these red snappers and also the clips that I use on the side are listed there. And just like that, my backing is loaded. And I should mention too, do you want to put my face on camera for a sec? I should mention too that part of the reason that I don't have to center the fabric, or part of the advantage to not centering the fabric, is just pulling it on straight allows for any crookedness or excess to fall off that far side. So that's why I said you need one straight line to begin with. But if the other line is a little bit uneven, it doesn't matter. And in fact, in today's current backing, there's two pieces sewn together. And so there's a little bit of a difference in the seam line on the one side. That doesn't matter either. I just rolled the whole thing on straight, and that will just get trimmed off when the quilt is finished. But you can see how nice and flat and smooth it is. Well, you can when Mr. Producer changes the camera. Okay, apparently there's a question on the loading. Let's have that, and we'll talk about that for a moment before we start the backing, or the batting. Dana, is there a tip to loading the back side of the batting on the red snapper? I find that the rolling on flips the back leader over it or draws up. Oh, I see what you're saying, Dana. So it's pulling the leader on. Okay, and there's a follow-up question. I feel like I need to weigh down my back leader so it doesn't crawl up with the backing. So this might vary, Dana, by machine. For myself, I find that my leaders are heavy enough if I leave it extended to where it's almost draping on the table. There's about 8 or 10 inches of leader hanging, and that's enough weight to keep it in place. I know what you mean. If I have the leader rolled close to the top and then I pull the fabric over, it pulls that leader right over. You described it with a flip. It flips that leader right over, exactly. So that's how I do it. I just leave more leader hanging, and I only start rolling it up when I'm nearing the end of the fabric and I need to see that bottom rim of it. Does that help? Hope so. Betsy, what happens if the second side is not even? It doesn't matter. I just leave enough excess so that all of it is catching under my red snapper, and if there's any excess that extends beyond that in some places, it doesn't matter. It gets trimmed off. So now I'm placing my batting, and today I'm using my perennial favorite, Hobbs 80-20, the 80% being cotton, the 20% being polyester. This is a great all-purpose batting. The cotton means it's, long wearing, and it has a little bit of shrinkage, so you get that traditional scrunchy, quilty look when you wash it. The poly means it doesn't shrink very much, and it has a nice bit of fluffy loft. And I'm using the natural or unbleached version today. And this is our quilt. This quilt was pieced by my friend Janet, and it's very 70s as to color and fabrics, and I just love it. It is the warmest, coziest quilt ever. And it's super simple. She's just done a very scrappy 9-patch. Do any of the fabrics repeat? I don't know. A few of them might. Oh yeah, I'm seeing a couple oranges that repeat. Anyway, this is our pretty fabric today. And then let's talk thread for a second. I need to get my spool off my bobbin winder so I can show you the second color. So I worked my way through a few thread choices today. What's the best camera, Mr. Producer, to look at my hands?
This one.
Okay. We're honestly, in the pre-show, I was quite honest about this. We've been having so much trouble with our cameras with a lag between what I'm saying and what I'm doing. And so it's easier if my face is just not on camera all that much today. So here are a couple of the colors that I considered. And honestly, there are a half dozen you could pick in this quilt, but I kind of narrowed it down to this middle kind of golden color because we do have whites and creams going on. We also have lots of that golden color, mid greens, mid oranges, and then darker browns, navies, reds. So I liked this central kind of light caramel color. And also I consider this wasabi green. I just plain adore this color, and I think it plays quite nicely across all of these fabric colors, and it plays into my color philosophy, which is I don't use the lightest one in the quilt and I don't use the darkest one in the quilt. I use something in that mid-range because I think it blends better all the way across. But I did finally come down on the side of the caramel because of the color of the backing, and I showed you that when we began. It's that golden straw kind of color. I didn't feel like the green on that backing was a look that I would love. Certainly is an option. If you like that contrast, go for it. But I decided to use the caramel. So that's what I've got loaded on my machine, both top and bottom. The number of the thread is, okay, you guys, see, here's the downside. Also in the pre-show, I was telling you, and I'll tell the story here as well. 0651 is the color. So the story here is this week I have a brand new thing, which is contact lenses. And instead of being bifocals, two prescriptions in one lens, they are monovision, one prescription in one lens and one prescription in the other. And the goal is that I can quilt without wearing glasses, but clearly it's not working all that well. Couldn't read the number on my thread color. So this week is still a trial run on the contact lenses, and then they're going to adjust my prescription. So this is helpful because I now have information to tell my eye doctor. So I'm now basting around the edges, and I'm going to tell you guys a couple points that this quilt illustrates well because it has so many seams happening. It is all too easy for those seams to get stretched a little bit as you're sewing along this outer perimeter. And if I let them stretch even 2 or 3 seams, I'm just going to move my stitching so you can see the camera. There we go. Can you see this now? If I let that stretch even 2 or 3 seams, it starts pushing it out of place. So I want to head that off at the pass. So I'm comfortable just doing it as I sew. I'm going to be watching the whole area and holding it in place. If you're not comfortable with that, you might want to drop some pins in so that it gives you kind of a measuring stick to know by the time I get to this point, I've got to have eased in anything that's in between there. But here's how I do it. I pull in the fabric that is already stitched, or I pull on that, and it pulls the other fabric ever so slightly faster under the needle. And I do that in 2 ways. Either I actually grab the fabric and pull it, or sometimes it's enough to just rest my thumb in front of the nose of the long arm, putting a little bit of tension on. So you'll see that as I stitch. If I rest my thumb, it just pulls this fabric under the needle, under the hopper foot, just a little bit faster. And that's all we need. So I do happen to have my channel lock on, so I know that I'm getting a straight seam. I don't have to be worrying about that. I can just watch to make sure these seam allowances are getting pulled under the needle as fast as they should, and they're not being allowed to push off into the distance. And I will do the same thing across the top of the quilt. I am fortunate to have channel locks on my machine. This does really help. You know, again, now I've got the horizontal channel lock on, so I know it is stitching in a straight line. So I can just use my hand to manipulate the fabric a little bit as I go and keep the top edge of that quilt under my straight line of stitching. And again, I'm either going to tug on this fabric that's already been stitched to pull this side under a bit more quickly, or often it's enough to just rest my hand on this left-hand side. You can see the nose of Lucy, the long arm, is right here. So resting my hand just pulls that under the needle a little faster. And the harder I push, the faster it pulls. So if I had more to ease, I could just put a little more pressure there. This one really doesn't have any easing that needs to be done. I'm just not allowing those seam allowances to push away or open up. And here's another tip. If any seam allowances are opening up just a little bit, I just do a little reverse over them to give them that extra little tack of security. The double row of stitching. So Mr. Producer is pointing out to me what I should have known, and that is I'm so close to the top of my machine. Hang on a second here. I've still got my channel lock in place. I will just move the stitching down just a little so you guys can see it better. Sorry about that. It's sometimes hard to keep my mind on all the things and look up at the camera as well to know what you're seeing. Okay. Whoops. Channel lock back on, Susan. There we go. Okay, now you can see. So again, my stitching line is straight. I'm using my hand here and even at the front to just manipulate my fabric a little bit and keep it within my straight stitching line. If you don't have a channel lock, you seriously might want to consider pinning. You might even want to use a ruler so that you get a nice straight edge on the outside of your quilt. Many of you know I have a studio cat, and I just stepped on his tail. He was that close to me, and I'm busy quilting and, you know, sliding my feet along, and I just stepped on his tail. Poor fella, he went away in. Hi, Dudgeon. Here you can see I'm grasping. I have a little bit I need to ease in here, so I'm grasping what's already stitched, pulling it more quickly under the needle. Doing that preventive easing is so much easier than trying to deal with a pleat that's wanting to form when it's kind of accumulated into a big problem. Okay, that is our basting done. So now what we've got, and I'm just trimming a couple threads here that I see, a couple sewing threads. Now what we've got is a quilt top that is secured on the left all the way across the top and on the right. And here's my fourth secured side. These are my trusty magnetic bars. They are just inexpensive bars from the hardware store. And I have metal rails on my quilting machine. So putting those on secures this fourth side. So now this whole quilting expanse can't move and shift. That's what I want. If I did not put something on the front, what happens when I start quilting up here is it just gradually pulls my fabric, especially in the centers because I've basted the edges, and then I end up with a quilt that's got a funny curve in the bottom. So securing that fourth side is really important, in my opinion. Alrighty, today we are going to quilt Paisleys. And I'm going to go ahead and quickly put my side snappers on before I start stitching. And maybe, do we have any questions coming in? Should I take some questions before I dive into quilting?
Yeah, we got one.
And sometimes you all watching remind me of things like my side snappers. I'm thinking of a lot of things here, and occasionally I actually miss my routine elements. So you guys feel free to remind me. Okay, we have a question. Northern Sioux, have you made a quilt yet, Dave? But I keep trying. He does know a lot of the terminology, though. He recognizes the vocabulary. Question, I have channel locks. How do you do a basted edge if the borders they've put on have way too much fabric and it's ruffled on the edge? I'm going to tell you one solution to that. Go back and watch my YouTube episode called The 2-Inch Minimizer. That was a little quilt that I was working on that had a crazy ruffled edge and gives some real specific tips on ways to deal with that. So have a watch of that episode. There are ways to take up quite a bit of excess in a border. And Sam, I use the back bar to make a straight line without a channel lock. That's a great idea, Sam. I assume maybe do you use a ruler or do you just use it as a visual cue? But that back bar is straight. So that's a great guideline for laying the top of your quilt out straight. Yep, good tip. Okay, that's it. You guys seem to know it all already. I'm just going to lower the quilt bar a little bit so it doesn't bounce as I'm quilting as much. And I did say we were quilting an edge-to-edge design, so that means the same quilting design across the whole quilt top without regard to seams or borders or anything like that. And Janet has chosen Paisleys, so that's what we're doing. I honestly do not know how well you'll be able to see the quilting on all these lovely prints. However, I will be sure to take some photographs afterwards and post them on my social media accounts so that you can get a good look at these paisleys. And now that I'm fairly comfortable, I'm going to go to my preferred way of stitching, which is to have constant speed on. And I'm just getting a comfortable speed set. And away we go. Okay, something's wrong here. That is not the speed I set. Let's see what happens when I change it. Time for some troubleshooting on Lucy. It should be about 3 times that fast. So we're back to the regulated stitch because that's what I know and that's what's working today. It seems like troubles are coming in all shapes and sizes today. Over the course of the week, we've been recording some content for the upcoming membership that I mentioned earlier, and just some extra YouTube content that is not live. And we've just been having this difficulty all week with the lag between when something is actually happening and when the sound comes through. You know how when sound travels, it's kind of like that. So that's been a struggle all week long, and we have done, it feels like everything. I say we loosely. Dave has done everything under the sun to try and troubleshoot what is going on. And we haven't really gotten it ironed out yet, so. We'll keep persevering. So Janet's request was a paisley design, which I absolutely love and think suits this quilt well. But there are a couple practical reasons why it's a great design for this quilt as well. As you can see, there are quite a lot of seams and quite a lot of seam intersections. And I always think a good edge-to-edge design gives you the ability to make the flattest quilt possible. So in this case, I want to make sure that these seam intersections are laying flat. And the paisley is a really easy design to fudge just a little bit as you go to make your stitching land where you want it to. So whenever I see these seam allowances that are kind of maybe puckering a little bit or just a bit puffy, I can shift where I'm quilting just a hair so that I'm quilting over those seams, or at least very close to, like 1/8 of an inch or less, like right there. This red one right here. If I stitch right over that, it will lay nice and smoothly for Janet. And honestly, this quilt does not have particularly bulky seam allowances, but that is a trick that I use a lot when I do have bulky seam allowances, is just choose a quilting design that you know will fudge a little bit so that you can, again, head that problem off early on. I always say quilting, getting a great looking quilt is a very cumulative process. It certainly starts with the cutting and the piecing and the pressing, but how you quilt it really has an effect on it as well. And it's not often visible to the final viewer, but you, the quilter, know. And the right quilting design on the right quilt, and I'm talking edge to edge now, the right choice of design can make all the difference. We were talking a few minutes ago about wavy borders, but you can also have very uneven areas in quilts or excess throughout the whole quilt that needs to be tucked in. And your design choice is really instrumental in doing that and doing it well. And not fighting against it and pulling your hair out. So, all that to say, for many reasons, Paisleys were a great choice for this quilt. I know you can't see the Paisleys super easily, but I'm aiming for 3 repeats on each Paisley, or 3, one central teardrop plus 2 echoes. But I'm doing as few as 2 or as many as 4 to, end up in the area that I'm trying to travel. I keep hoping that we'll come across a few more solid looking prints so you can see the quilting a little better. But I don't know if it's going to happen. I talked to you about the thread color, but I don't think I mentioned the thread type I use. What I have loaded is the Isocord brand, and it's 100% poly thread in a 40 weight. Polyester threads are strong, which makes them attractive for long arm quilters, and also they are very low lint. Also a very great feature. I particularly like the Isocord brand because they have over 300 colors to choose from, and I quite like the ability to choose just the right shade of caramel or wasabi green or whatever the case may be. I know there are other quilters who use a much narrower selection of thread choices, and that's totally fine, but I do like having the ability to pick just the right shade. And I have the same thread loaded top and bottom. One thing I didn't do when we began is put my yardsticks up, and I'm going to stop and do that now. So these are just holding up my end grippers just a little so that my long arm does not bump into my whatever the side gripper apparatus you're using at the end. I don't want to risk any squared off paisleys. And we ran out of bobbin thread. I knew it was coming soon because I started with a partial bobbin. So my method is just to let it run out. Dave, would you pass me my blue seam ripper that's right back there? I bet you guys have never done this. Borrowed your good seam ripper for use at another machine. I bet you don't have a producer to call though and say, hey, grab my seam ripper for me. Anyway, back to the story at hand. There are ways on long arm machines to set, you know, how many revolutions of the bobbin, for example, and then you know when a bobbin is about to run out, you get a warning. For me, I don't like to mess with that because it seems like a constant adjustment to get it accurate and or a waste of thread. So I just quilt till the bobbin runs out, and then I do what I'm doing now, which is back up because the last couple of inches didn't have proper tension on them. And also because it's much easier to camouflage the starting point at a corner. So I'm just going to the last corner that I quilted on a paisley, and that's where I'll do my little lock stitch to begin with my new bobbin. Riveting, I know, watching someone undo their quilting. I should ask here though, I'm actually considering doing a little YouTube video on undoing, which is not a very exciting topic, but is a critical one for long arm quilters. Does that interest you guys? Would you like to see some sort of tips and maybe even tricks toward undoing quickly and how to deal with the holes left in the quilt and that sort of thing? So while I'm out of camera, this is how long it takes me to set up my bobbin winder to get a new bobbin going. And I'm actually rethreading it because if you recall, I grabbed the spool of thread earlier to show you my color choices. So that's how long it takes to set up the bobbin winder. So that's why I choose to wind my own. It enables me to have the matching thread that I like, and it only takes a jiffy.
And the answer is yes. Please, yes.
And I dropped, don't know if you noticed this, it's so automatic for me. I dropped my seam ripper right where my end point was so that I don't have to hunt on this busy quilt. And I just do that all the time. When I have undone something or I'm putting on a new bobbin, I just drop my blue seam ripper right there. Then I know right where it is.
The answer is yes please, but I don't have the head camera, so give me a second to find it. Give me a moment. I don't have the great deal.
Mr. Producer's looking for the camera. While he does that, I'm going to grab just a little sip of my magic elixir. Try not to gulp in the microphone. Okay.
How do you want to stitch or something, or yes, you would like to see a video on how you want to stitch?
Okay, it sounds like we're getting lots of comments. Yes, we'd like to see a video on unpicking. So yes, I will work on that. Then I just pause at my next corner, clip my thread tails, and as you saw, I did not knot and bury. I just did some close, tight stitches overlapping where I ended. Certainly on a quilt this busy, no one is ever going to find that little overlap. But from my own personal experience, it's got to be a pretty special quilt for me to take the time to knot and bury threads. You know, again, each quilter kind of has their own preference, and I know there are quilters who always knot and bury their threads, but I am not one of them. Can you see right here where this seam allowance, you know, there's just a kind of a little bulkiness going on there, and I just purposely stitched right over that because that will help it lay down beautifully smoothly in the finished quilt. That is the beauty of stitching freehand, is you can do that little bit of fudging so easily. There, you can see the quilting on the green and brown patch, the green and brown block. We'll come back to that in just a moment. I feel like that's the first time you've been able to see the Paisleys, but there they are. Alrighty, so I'm going to stop with my needle down, undo all my apparatuses. Is that the correct plural for an apparatus, or is it apparati? Does anybody know? So magnets, side clamps, all the things. And again, I've just stopped with needle down, so Lucy is going to roll with me as I advance the quilt. Lucy does have a 26-inch throat, which is a very broad quilting area, and I love that. For edge-to-edge quilting, it's really efficient with my time. But for today's purposes, I'm only going to roll partially so that you have a good clear vision and the roll of quilt does not obstruct. Let me just get my basting in place and then we'll take a few more questions. How does that sound? So while I finish this basting, apparently there's a few of you that are asking about the membership again. I didn't give a whole lot of details about it except to say it is becoming available to newsletter subscribers over the next few days. So if you want to be among that crowd, then either just pop over to my website and an opt-in type form will pop up. It's usually with something free that I'm giving away, but you have to provide your email address to get it. And that's an easy way to get on my newsletter list. Or if you use Facebook or Instagram, you can send me a message, a direct message with the word news or newsletter in it. And that will give a little auto respond with a link to sign up for the newsletter.
Apparatuses or just apparatus is the plural form?
So someone is chiming in that just the word apparatus, it's both the singular and the plural.
Or apparatuses.
I can't believe Dave's not looking this up already on Google. He's standing there with the keyboard right in front of him and hasn't Googled it already.
I'm busy.
He's laughing at me. He's busy, he said. So.
Ready for questions?
Okay, let me just drop my magnets on and then we are ready for a few questions and a sip of my lukewarm coffee. All right, I'm ready. Are you able to adjust the color at all? Sorry it's dark, you guys. Just curious, what size are the blocks and the size of Paisley? The blocks are I would say the finished 9 patch is 6 inches. So the finished little squares would then be 2. They must have been charm size squares to start with. And the size of my paisley, my inner teardrop is pretty close to 2 inches long. And then the whole thing is, 3 to 4. And, some a little more, some a little less. Paisleys are super easy to scale up or down. You could make them a lot bigger and have much looser quilting on the quilt top. You could, but this is what I chose. Partly, I guess, because there is a seam every 2 inches. I want to quilt down as many of those seams as I can, right? So a little bit finer, like most of my quilting spacing is 1/2 to 5/8 of an inch between lines of quilting. I feel like that holds those seam lines flat very nicely. You do not make a knot at the beginning or at the end. I don't make a knot. I do what I call a lock stitch. So it's 4 or 5 stitches in very, very, very close succession, like the space where 1 or 2 stitches usually would be. So stitch, 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 really close, and then off with the regular stitches. And I do that both beginning and ending. Kimberly, have you ever worked with a mid-arm machine? If so, do you recommend? I can't say that I have, Kimberly. I started quilting on my domestic machine, which had about an 11-inch throat space, 10 or 11. So I've done a fair bit of that, but I have not worked very much at all on a long arm or on a mid-arm machine, no. Northern Sue, how do you store your threads, please? Sue, that's another little episode that's going to be coming up. Oh, look, Dave has a picture of the mess for you. Woohoo! That's how I store my threads. But I am actually wanting to prep a little episode of that too, because I kind of have a nifty bobbin storage trick that I'd like to show. And it was my son's idea. My son, the golfer, had this great idea for storing bobbins. So I'll show you that in upcoming weeks. What brand of bobbin winder do you use? The Gamble brand is a bit pricey. Funny story on that one, Shelley. Mine is a bit, it's a bit like a mongrel dog. I have a mongrel bobbin winder. The base of it is a Gamble brand, and it came with my machine, but the winding apparatus was entirely worn out. Like I could not get a smooth bobbin. So I bought one, and I think, I can't even say the brand name. I got it off Amazon. It's not Gamble brand, the winder itself. You can see it there. And we just screwed it, Dave, the handyman, screwed it onto my Gamble base. So it's got a nice little table that it sits on and the thread, holder. But that actual winder portion is just one that I bought off Amazon. And it does beautifully. I've had it for years.
Other than that, I think that's it. Except for how big, I think we answered this already.
Miranda, roughly how big are the squares in your quilting motif? Got that one already. Yep.
And it's just for you. Your other grammar not seen.
Apparatuses are just apparatus is the plural form according to Google. Thanks for that. I appreciate it. I love word trivia. So.
Shut up, Sam.
Sam says, looks great. Woohoo. Well, I should just give Sam a mention right here. Sam is a fellow quilter from BC. And for those of you who are interested in the membership, one of the October pieces of content that's coming out is a guest lesson by Sam. She's a great quilter. She does a lot more custom work than I do. So I did that loading process without much talking, but basically all I did was advance the quilt and baste again down my left and right sides, and then put my side clamps on and also my magnets on the front of the quilting machine. And I'm actually going to pause here for a minute because in my talking I did forget something which I like to do. That is, when I did the first, you can see me in the small screen, when I did the first pass, I began in what was my upper right-hand corner and I worked to the left. No matter how hard I try to do paisleys in every direction, they end up kind of leaning that way. So I like to alternate passes so that when you look at the quilt as a whole, they don't look like they're all flowing in one direction, right? They look more random and organic. So I'm going to pause right there and I'm going to start on the left side. For those of you who have seen which Lady Hawk, yeah, a classic 80s movie. The old monk, walk on the left side. That's me. But I do think that alternating the direction of passes helps the quilting to look more organic, but also helps you as a quilter because quilting that way aids in forcing you to quilt in every direction. Up, down, left, right. That is a learned skill, and you can beef up that skill by quilting in both directions, even with your edge-to-edge work. Again, forgot my yardstick. Let's just tuck that in case. I don't actually think I'm at risk of hitting my side clamps, but just in case. We don't want any square paisleys. Stop and pick that navy thread off. Okay, threads are persistent. You guys know it. It stuck on my finger and dropped in another place on the quilt. And here we've got a little bit of seams, it feels like, or maybe pressed in differing directions on the back. They're not laying perfectly flat. So I'm using my left hand to just put a little bit of tension on the fabric, much like I did when I was basting. It just kind of stretches it over the nose of the long arm just a hair and enables all these seams to get quilted down flat without forming pleats as I bump up against them. Nobody will be any the wiser when it's all finished, I promise. Dave, would you hand me those 2 cans that are right by the bobbin winder? I'm going to show you guys a nifty trick. Over time, I've gotten comfortable, being able to use my left hand to manipulate the fabric, but if you're not at that point, here's a handy little trick for you, and I'll wait for Dave to get the overhead camera on. What's the best one to see it? Probably a larger view would be better. Okay, so I have here a couple cans of vegetables, which I don't know how I acquired these because I never buy these. They're disgusting to eat, but this is a great use for them. Putting them on the sides of your long arm. So the long arm is right under here, and putting this small weight, water bottles would work too, anything that's, pound and a half. Putting this small weight does the same thing. It just kind of pulls everything sort of taut and flat, and you can then quilt it into place. And the beauty of these cans, if you align them, front to back, is when you're quilting now, they'll just roll out of place as the arm comes up against them, so you don't have to resituate them every time you get close to them, which you would have to do if you laid them this way. Make sense? So a lot of quilters call that the old can of beans trick, but a can of anything will work, or something of similar weight. I don't think I can overemphasize this idea of managing excess fabric like this a little bit at a time is worlds better than waiting for, just plowing ahead with your quilting and then all of a sudden you've got a pleat and then trying to cope with that. If you see any excess fullness, manage it as you go. There's a lot that you can deal with, a lot of fullness you can pull in if you just do it a little bit at a time. if you want to see more of that and more of my tricks toward that, I also have a pair of episodes called Vintage Gems, in which I was quilting a vintage double wedding ring quilt, and it had tons and tons of excess fabric. There was a certain shape that was pieced into the quilt that just puckered and rippled everywhere. And so I chose an edge-to-edge design. So in those episodes, I talk about design choice and then about different ways that you can manipulate and deal with that excess. And then if you look at the finished product of that quilt, the finished pictures of it, it is absolutely remarkable. You would never know that it was such a problematic quilt. And it was awfully rewarding to do. Like, I love quilting vintage things, but sometimes they can be a real challenge. This particular one was hand-pieced, as they often are, you know, and rotary cutters and, you know, marking rulers and squaring up were not things that quilters did back in the day. They just figured it would quilt out, right? And so it can be a challenge as a modern machine quilter to deal with that excess. But there are ways, and it's really, really rewarding to be able to finish one of those quilts and know that it's going to be used and loved for years to come. Stop and trim this thread. I can see that it's a sewing thread, so I'm not just going to pull it, I'm going to trim it. sewing thread. Oh, that's a loose one. Look, we found a green and brown square so you can see again. For the most part, all of these live and unscripted episodes are client quilts. So my choices for quilts are, well, I won't say limited by what comes in, but dictated, maybe that's the word, by what quilts are coming in from clients. And so I confess I didn't really think about the fact that this one is a busy print and it's not super easy to see. I just saw all these gorgeous 70s colors and thought, oh, that will be so pretty, and ran with it. But let's face it, pretty much never do I have one that's solid colors that you can see really well, so that's just the nature of it. But hopefully that's part of the charm of this show too, is that you're seeing real life quilts. Be typing in your questions if you have any as I'm coming to the end of this pass. And again, if you're enjoying this or finding it helpful, would you take a moment to click on the thumbs up and on the subscribe button? And if you'd like notifications of when I am going live, you can also click on the little bell after you've subscribed, and YouTube will send you a reminder. And sharing too. Sharing never hurts. So again, I've stopped with needle down. I've taken off all my apparatuses that's holding it in place, and oh, I see what the trouble is. My red snapper is kind of thick and not allowing it to roll. So I'm just going to go ahead and advance while the needle is down. And then I'll come back and baste both sides and get everything set for the next step. Okay, we have a couple questions. I can't see the feed. Here we are. Rena, I would love to see a video of how you clean and oil Lucy. Yes, also on my short list. I feel like some of these really basic topics, skills, aren't shown very often. So yeah, great idea, Rena. Thanks for that. Shelby, I'm looking forward to taking your freehand masterclass in November. Should I wait to register for it until closer to November, or register now and be in when it begins next? You ought to wait to register. It's not actually open at this moment, so I don't think you could. I do have a waitlist link. I think if you go to the masterclass on my website right now, it will send you to the waitlist. You know, again, this is an example of all those moving parts, and hopefully I've got the moving parts in place. But also, Shelby, there will be things coming up in October. I'll be doing some workshops and a number of free content type things that you might want to get in on too. And so I'll be talking lots about the masterclass over the next couple of weeks in October, and you'll have lots of opportunities. Kirsty, fascinating geese behind you. Thank you. I've had this hanging for the last couple of episodes, and I always get comments on it. I love it too. This is an original design, and it's straight out of my scrap bag. Geese and background alike, and it just is happy colors. Betsy, could you talk through your thought process as you quilt so you determine when and how you change direction without having to stop and plan ahead? Okay, I can talk about that for a second, Betsy, before I start quilting. And there's a follow-up. Oh, I hope you understand what I'm asking. I know that eventually experience helps, but how do you start? Well, I will say, Betsy, that within my masterclass, that's one of the things that I do is break down the designs, and this Paisley happens to be one of them. There's 31 or 32. And I slow down the process and do it on a solid fabric so you can see and walk through, okay, I could do this, or I could do that, or I could do that, and here's what I choose and here's why. So that's part of what that masterclass is really drilling down into the brass tacks of the design. I don't know that there's time to do it here, and certainly there's not great visibility to do it here. But I'll give you this starting point. One of the skills that you want to develop as a quilter, honestly, is your peripheral vision. So I am pretty much never looking at my needle. My eye is elsewhere. It's either where I'm going with my next shape, or it's taking quick glances to, to where I've been and where I need to head on the quilt next. But for sure, it's my next, Paisley shape. My eye is not with my needle as it's going. My eye is, okay, where am I heading? And then it's back around, right? So, and then the whole thing of practicing what direction, because I know I want to travel, that direction, for example. Which way should I enter the Paisley? That does come with some experience, and I do talk through that a lot more in the masterclass. So I hope that helps you a little bit to get a starting point. Lori, do you ever use your place when quilting on busy fabrics? All the time. And I'm losing it today. I actually had one crossover line here today that I already saw, and I had no way to really show you guys because it just doesn't show up on screen. And I'll tell you what I do. I have a floor lamp that I put off to one side, and I turn off all my lights. I turn off the room lights, I turn off my overhead bar, and I turn off my machine light. So the only light source is that strong light shining in from the side, and basically quilt by shadow. That's the best thing I've found on the most difficult fabrics to see, whether they're busy prints or whether it's black. Even black light will not always show up, like especially on a busy print. It doesn't really help to make it visible, but that really strong side light does help. Okay. If you happen to be on Instagram and watch some of my quilting reels, that's often how I record them, because it's the very best way to actually show up the quilting. And you're seeing in action all the things I talked about with basting this side edge. I've got the channel lock on, and so I am adjusting the edge of my quilt to be straight with that line of stitching. I'm pulling the fabric under the needle a little bit faster. All those things I just do quickly as I'm working. Okay, there was one more question coming in. Should we have a look at that? Franny, how are the contacts doing so far, and what are 10 called again? Okay, I'm not sure about that second question. The contacts are doing okay, but they're not as good as my glasses, so I'll be having a conversation with the doctor. Might have to tweak the prescription. But I thought it was a good trial run, because that's what these first 2 weeks are all about, is determining if they're answering the need. And they're not quite there yet. Interestingly, they don't bother me. Like, I was worried that I would feel dizzy or headachy or something having a different prescription in each eye. That has not bothered me at all, so I'm pleased about that. You had a question, Dave? Look at this. I'll point this out to you guys. See this seam right here? The camera you had was better. The camera you had was better. See right here where there's this little jog where the seam, where the two fabrics were joined? That is one of the things you don't have to worry about when you use this method of loading, where you load the first straight edge and then you just pull it on straight. You don't even have to worry about that. It's just going to get trimmed off in the end. The only time it's a bit of a nuisance is when you're trying to put the side clamp on. And occasionally I can't get my side clamp over that jog depending on the type of fabric or how bad the jog is, in which case I would just use, I'll pull it over so you can see it. Let's see, there we go. I would just use my individual clamp, you know, for this one pass and just hold it right there. That works in a pinch. This time I'll remember my yardstick to hoist up my clamp a little bit, or some people use a curtain rod or a little PVC pipe or anything that's long and straight. And I'm just clamping the other side, and then we're ready to go again. And again, the red snapper system, which these side clamps are part of, they are linked in the show notes. They are developed and sold by an online shop. Well, there's a brick and mortar store too called Quilts on the Corner. And that's where I got mine. Okay, last time I started at my left and quilted to the right, so this time I'm starting at my right and quilting to the left. Someone was asking earlier about whether I knot the threads. So let me just take a moment to show this one a little bit. I am in the basting stitch, the seam line at the right, so it wouldn't really matter if they showed, but I always use the same process. I'm hanging on to my top thread. Can you see right here? I take one stitch, and that enables me to pull up my bobbin thread. Okay, so now I've got them both hanging on to them, and then I just stitch, 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 stitch 4 or 5 times really close together, and that locks it. So if I'm out in the middle of the quilt doing that, I try to line it up like on the previous stitching. For example, if I run out of a bobbin, I just overlap it 2 or 3 stitches from what was previously there, lock that in place, and then go on. And I just try to put it, you know, on a seam or somewhere where it's unobtrusive, or in a corner of my quilting. These Paisleys have lots of corners, so that works. And I am quilting in regulated stitch mode. I did try to use my constant mode earlier, which is a fixed speed, and I like to go quite fast. And it does not seem to be giving me the right speed. It's going quite slowly. So to add to our problematic morning is figure out why Lucy's not stitching in constant speed. We'd have to call it constant slow. I tell you what though, I'm grateful for how trouble-free my machine is in general. Over the years, I've had, you know, a certain amount of maintenance to do, but I've never been unable to quilt for more than a couple of days at a time. And this is fresh in my mind because yesterday I was visiting with another long arm quilter that's local to me, and she's had difficulty with her machine, and she has been down for months, either waiting on parts or waiting on a maintenance person or all of the above. So I'm grateful for Lucy. She's a trooper. I'm curious if any of you keep kind of a logbook of quilts that you do. I do that for several reasons. One is just for my own interest to know how many quilts I've quilted, but also I use it for billing purposes because I quilt as a business. So I note down, it's kind of my first set of information. I note who the quilt is for, and I identify it with a little description, and I put the measurements with it as well. So I just have a little composition book that I do that in. But having said all that, I just recently passed the 1100 mark for quilts, and all but about 20 of those have been freehand. It's kind of a running joke in my family. I do have a tablet and a digital system on my quilting machine, and we call it an expensive paperweight because I really don't use it. Like I said, about 20 quilts out of those 1100 have been done with that digitized system. But you know what? I know what I love, and I have found what I love, and so I don't regret the exploration. And maybe someday I'll get a little more IT literate and I'll digitize some of these designs, but so far that day has not come. Here again is a good example of a kind of knobby seam allowance intersection, and I'm going to make an effort to stitch very near to that. And I'll go back around so that you can see it. See how beautifully that lays down now that it's been stitched? Again, that's the beauty of being able to aim your stitching. It's just one more layer in making the quilt look gorgeous. Betsy, you were asking about determining direction. And one of the ways I do it is I have a kind of overall way that I move across my quilt. Not sure that you can see it fully on this camera, but on some of the bigger views, I keep the areas further away from me quilted more, and then I'm doing the areas closer to me last, if that makes sense. So you're going to see that I'm kind of angling across the quilt with each pass. So I am, by and large, moving up and to the left, northwest. And when I get that pretty well filled in, then I'll be heading back southeast. So that just helps me in general to determine where I'm going with my quilting next, so that I don't get painted into a corner. So here again, I'm quilting at the far side of my quilt, and now I'm going to head back southeast. And I know it's perhaps upside down for you on camera, but if I use those words, perhaps it will help you to envision which direction I'm actually moving. And now I'm going northwest again. So, you know, each individual paisley may twist and turn this way and that, but by and large, that's the area I'm filling in. Speaking of busy prints, this is one, this gold and orange, where it's really hard to see where I've stitched. I had to pause there for just a second just to take stock of where I'm at. Maybe Mr. Producer would put on a wider angle lens, as we've been talking about the direction, the larger scope of direction that I'm moving, and that way you could get a better view of how it looks in relation to the quilt top. Dave, could we do the wider angle view so that they can kind of see the whole quilt top and see what direction I'm moving in? There we go. So I'm kind of at that northwest corner and I'm moving back southeast again. And again, each individual paisley may turn one direction or another, but by and large, that's where I'm moving with my quilting. Going northwest again now. And you can see I'm really filling in that northwest corner before I head back southeast again. What's further away from me is always further along in the quilting process, so that I don't end up with an area in back of where I'm currently quilting that hasn't been quilted yet. Does that make sense? And also, if this is new to you, like this design has lots of corners. There's no shame in pausing at that corner and saying, now do I want to go this way, or do I want to go this way, or do I want to go this way? Just take a moment and think it through where you'll end up, and gradually it will become second nature. And that one's finished. Again, great time to be typing in some questions. This will be our last pass coming up, and it's a fairly short one because there's not much left on the quilt. I don't think I mentioned earlier that I actually loaded the quilt with the length of it from side to side. It's just more efficient because there's fewer advances than of the quilt, right? And sometimes I change that depending on where the seams are in the backing or where the straight edge is. But whenever I can, I like to load it so that the length of the quilt actually goes from side to side for me. And there's the end right there. I haven't spoken very much as I advanced about the batting, but maybe you noticed, each time I advance the quilt, I grasp the batting a little bit, or the batting and the quilt together if the quilt is still hanging over the edge, and tug it a bit. It might just be my machine, but in my experience, the center of the batting wants to pull up faster and the edges tend to get a little stretched out. So I'm adjusting that as I go. It's just one more thing that if you address it as you go in little increments, you don't end up with a big old problem at the end. Okay, I understand there are more questions, but I'm going to go ahead and baste around this so that I can move Lucy out of the way. And then I will stand and answer as many questions as you have. And sometimes I do my basting on the sides by guess and by gosh, but across this bottom edge, I always put my channel lock on. Or in your case, you know, you might want to use a ruler to line it up with your bottom rail. I want this bottom edge to be straight, and so I like to have that channel lock on. There are occasions and reasons for which I'll adjust it a stitch or two, but by and large, I feel like I can keep my quilt very close to square if I keep this straight channel lock on. And sometimes I have to kind of tug my fabric down, and sometimes, as you saw a moment ago, I'm kind of squooshing it up, and that little bit of excess I'll be able to quilt in, and it enables me to have a straight edge on my quilt. I'd rather ease that excess in than have a funny curved edge on the edge of my quilt. So again, I'm using all the means at my disposal. My hand is putting weight on here to pull this under the needle a little faster because it's wanting. Every time I hit a seam allowance, it's wanting to push out of the way in front of the hopper foot. So the weight of my hand is pulling that under the needle a little bit faster. My fingers are at the ready for grabbing or adjusting any little bits. And just take your time. It's way easier to take your time and do it once than to have to undo it. And if your machine has a basting stitch, that works really well too. I just don't feel like changing the stitch length, and so I just left my regular stitch length on, but you absolutely could take a moment to turn a basting or looser, longer stitch length on. Again, the weight of my thumb here is pulling this on a little faster. I can see that there's a little bit of excess happening here. I don't want to end up with a pleat when I join up to my previous stitching, right? So just this little simple technique of putting weight on at the front or pulling, literally pulling on the edge, will ease that under the needle. And there you see I joined up with what was stitched before. No pleat in sight. So I'm happy. I'm going to put my edge clamps on. We don't need any front magnets this time. And then I will take your questions. It's a little tricky because there's a seam allowance now to get in this clamp. I got it. Okay, let's take a question or two. Jackie, what techniques do you use to stay flowing evenly while quilting? I build tension mistakes and have to stop frequently. So are you using a constant speed and that's creating tension mistakes? I'm not fully sure what you're asking, but it is certainly something that I'm conscious of, Jackie, and it's one of the reasons I like using the constant stitching mode, which is not regulated, because it forces you to be smooth and even and not to go vroom, vroom, vroom with your paisleys, right? So I am conscious of that, and using the constant mode even sometimes helps me learn to do that in my quilting skill. Hope that helps. Franny, my machine does not like going right to left for a very long stretch. It will skip stitches and shred the thread. Is there a way to make it work both ways? You know, again, I think it's a really good idea to contact someone who's a rep with your machine brand, and or get into some Facebook groups with other people who own that same brand of machine, because they will have tips. I know that common ones are that you turn your needle just a tiny bit, because that's part of the stitch formation process with the rocker foot underneath. And if you change that timing just a hair, like instead of it being at 6 o'clock, it could be at 5:35 or 5:25, that will sometimes help to be able to stitch in both directions. So that might be the first thing you try. Judy, if there's a seam in the backing, what is the right way to load it, horizontal or vertical? Well, first off, there's not a wrong way. My preferred way is to have that seam be horizontal, because then it's not, you know, forming a tight kind of pull when it runs vertical. But it depends. Like, is there more than one seam? And there sometimes is, and you just can't do it only horizontally. Is it smooth and flat, in which case it matters much less? Is it a directional quilting that I need to be concerned about it? So lots of things come into play. I've done it both ways. There's not a right or a wrong. But if I have my druthers and all of the things being equal, I like it horizontal. Yes. Is that it? Oh, one more. Nope, that's Franny again. Did we get any comments about keeping a journal or a log of projects that you quilt? Sue Donnelly, yes, I have a log with pictures. Ones where I make the top and write what I used in thread and what I do differently next time, number of quilting stitches. That's a great idea. That's honestly more information than I do. I do know other quilters who do that even when quilting for clients. They'll have, you know, what pattern they used, that sort of thing, so that they keep a variety for that client and that sort of thing. I'm not that detailed, but it is really nice to look back over the log, for example, at the end of the year and see how many quilts you've done. Catherine, I also have a log of the quilts that I've done. Good. Diana, I would like to see an episode on unsewing. Sometimes need to take out a good portion due to tension and would love to see how you handle unpicking. Yes, I do want to do one, and my thought process is still kind of going as to how, like, it can be difficult to create bad tension in order to show it. So I'm still working that one out, but I do want to do that. Okay, that's it. All right, guys, which side did I start on last time? I think I started on right, so I'm starting on the left. Hopefully I'm right. Hopefully I'm right, ha ha ha. Otherwise I might get left behind. Oh, let me put my yardstick in again here. My yardsticks, by the way, are vintage. They were my grandfather's. I don't know what year they're from. 40s, 30s, something like that. So it's quite fun to have them in my studio. So as always, if you're enjoying this, finding it helpful, please give it a thumbs up. That helps YouTube to send other people to see it. And don't forget, if you have a chance this week to have a listen to the podcast, the most recent episode was with a designer. Her name is Karina Gardner. And she's designed many things, from dishware to stationery to scrapbooking supplies. And she currently designs for Riley Blake. She designs fabric for Riley Blake Designs. But she is also a business builder. And so she teaches classes. I think she has a full-fledged course on how to make designing your business, because it is, after all, about more than just creating pretty things. So it was really fun talking with her. And so you may be interested in that if designing has ever appealed to you, or if you just want to see kind of behind the scenes into that process. So Karina Gardner is her name. And if you want to look her up on social media, she's Karina Gardner everywhere. So can you see how my process of moving around the quilt is playing out here? I quilt the areas furthest away from me first, and then when I get down to this end that's closest to me, I'm actually finishing off the bottom edge. And that's the time when it's most easy to get yourself quilted into a corner. Is when you're closing up that front edge and then you're all of a sudden like, oh, how do I finish that area that was further away? So it really, you can really see that illustrated here, how well that works. And we're out of bobbin thread. So remember my method, just let it run out and then undo a little bit. Boy, it's difficult to see. I picked a doozy of a spot. Goodness gracious. Okay, I might have to get out my glasses, folks. I'm also hampered by the fact that we turn the machine light off for your viewing ease, and so I don't have good lighting where I'm working at all. I may have to turn it on. Okay, bear with me a second so that I can see what I'm doing. I'll turn it back off when I start quilting again. There we go. Once I find a tail, I'm golden. So again, I'm just rewinding a few inches. First off, because the tension, there was no tension on the bobbin thread for the last couple of inches, so that's got to come out. That's poor quilting. And then also, it's just easier to camouflage. Not that anybody could see it on here, but it's easier to camouflage at a corner of quilting. So I'm just going to go back to the point of the paisley. And you can see here why, if you put that overlap and those lock stitches into a seam allowance, they're never coming out. You can see how much trouble I had undoing the stitches through that seam allowance. It's just because it's going through several layers of fabric, it's really locked in place there. Okay, so now I'm at the corner. Drop my seam ripper right there and thread my needle again because I bumped that at some point. And turn the light out. So the seam ripper is there for reference. And I'll run grab my fresh bobbin. So again, it just takes the length of time that I'm out of camera to set up a new bobbin and get it winding. All right, so one person is commenting that they could see the stitching better with the light on. So I'll put it on for a little bit. I know it makes the colors of the rest of the quilt washed out looking, but if you can see the stitching better, let's do a little stitching like this and then you can see it. Whoops. I'm just taking stock of where I am, pausing in a corner to clip my thread tails. And by the way, I love these little curved pointed scissors. They're just very handy for clipping very near to the quilt. Have no idea what brand they are, so can't help you find a pair. But they're out there. Chime in a little bit if you would. Does that make it easier to see the actual stitching with the light on? And if so, we'll keep it on. If you're finding it's more difficult to see, let us know. Are we getting any feedback about the lighting? Just keep going. Just keep stitching. Not sure if you can see in the light of the machine, but there's just a little bit of excess bolt going on in here that's not laying perfectly smoothly. So again, I'm using my left hand. If you're not comfortable doing that and quilting with one hand, get out your trusty vegetable cans or weights and just put them on both sides, and they'll shift as you move with your quilting, and just that little bit of stretch on the fabric helps to ease it under the needle a little more quickly, and will pretty much get rid of those pesky pleats for you. And again, if you want to see lots of fullness being eased in, check out the episode Vintage Gems. There's actually 2 episodes because I did the entire quilt and it was a pretty big one. It was a double wedding ring, vintage and hand pieced, and it had a lot of excess fabric going on. So I give some really practical tips in that episode for how to deal with all those ripples and rumples. like so many things in life, the ability of fabric to stretch, you know, is sometimes makes it difficult to make a perfectly flat quilt, but it also works in our favor when we're trying to manipulate it a little bit. So it's just a characteristic of fabric. It stretches, it moves, it has flex. Sometimes it works against you, but many times you can use it in your favor. At least as quilters, we get to use it in our favor. We're almost finished, so if you have any last questions or comments, pop them in right now into the chat window. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this episode, to give it a thumbs up. And there's the end. A few little lock stitches in there and we are finished. I thought what I might do is quickly undo one end and hold the backing up so you can see the quilting a little bit. I'll see if that works on camera. Meantime, as I said, be typing in any questions or comments if you have them. And I will just quickly unload it, and that way I can hold it up so you can see. Now let's see if I shift around in the light. There's a decent glimpse of it. And I'll just slowly move it a little bit and hopefully you'll get glimpses of the paisley. There you go. So I will, over the next couple of days, take some photographs of it and I'll share them on social media so you can get some good close-up looks. Can I change the camera? Let me get my last few sips here. I'll stand back from the quilt. So satisfying. Okay, Catherine, you spoke about using your grandfather's yardsticks. I use my husband's old pool sticks. The light on the quilt shows stitches very nicely. I love the old pool sticks. There's just something about bringing the people that you love into your quilting studio. Catherine, I love the quilt that's hanging behind you. Thank you. That is a quilt. There's no pattern for it. It's just something that I dreamed up entirely out of my scrap bin, but I do love the colors, so warm and cheerful. Any more? Oh yeah, lots more apparently. Question, is your spacing about a 1/2 inch in your paisleys? Thanks for showing your process to keep the quilt square. Yes, 1/2 inch to 5/8-ish. That was kind of my guideline. And what is preferred batting? What I use today is my go-to. It's the Hobbs I think it's their heirloom line, but it's the 80/20 cotton poly. It's very economical as to price. It washes well. It is good about not getting creases when you fold the quilt. It has a little bit of shrinkage, so you get that quilty feel when you do wash your quilt a couple of times. It's easy to work with. It's my favorite batting. Franny, so when you finish quilting and trim the quilt, do you trim away from the edges or right on them? I trim just a slight 1/4 inch away from the basted edge, so that, because most people when they sew their binding on use a 1/4 inch seam allowance or close to it, so that that basting all falls in the seam allowance and never has to be undone, right? It just gets incorporated into the line of binding. Can't remember if I said all those B words right, but I want that seam allowance and my basting stitch to all fall inside the seam for the binding. Catherine, love the texture of this design. It is a pretty one. I do love it too. And that's it. Okay, folks, thanks so much for joining me. So once again, I'm Susan Smith. You're in my studio, Stitched by Susan. And these live and unscripted episodes air the first and third Friday of each month. They are most frequently a freehand edge-to-edge design like this one. That's what I love to show, is how beautiful it can be, how non-mysterious it is, and just real time of some of the processes that I go through in my quilting studio to square things up, to deal with challenges, those sorts of things. So first and third Friday of every month. And I alluded to my new membership, which is slowly being launched. Some of my students that have already enrolled in my masterclass are using it already, and over the next few days more info will be going out in my newsletter with an introductory offer. So if you're at all interested in that, then either go to my website, there will be a pop-up there to sign up for anything that'll get you on my newsletter list, or secondly, if you're on social media in both Facebook and Instagram, you can send me a message with the word news in it, and that will send you a little link to sign up for the newsletter. So that's going to be coming out within the next couple of days, and it is just kind of more of this. It's a more in-depth look at some of these processes. Sometimes it's a quilt along where I show you from beginning to end of a more complicated quilt. Sometimes it's custom quilting and some of the things that I deal with in that. So it's just another avenue to sort of look over my shoulder in my studio. So I invite you to have a look at that. What else? The podcast. Don't forget, if you need a little light listening, Measure Twice, Cut Once, life lessons learned from quilters and other crafters. So that's available, podcast.stitchedbysusan.com. So with that, thanks so much for joining me. I'm off to refill my cup, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.